The auction yard reeked of rust, sweat, and resignation. A dry wind swept through the rows of battered metal fencing, rattling loose chains and stirring clouds of dust that clung to the boots of the weary souls gathered there. Horses snorted nervously in their pens, their eyes wide with confusion, some too tired to resist, others too broken to care. The auctioneer's voice droned overhead, cracking like a whip, barking numbers with machine-like indifference. Claire stood near the back, clutching the strap of her canvas backpack like it was the only thing holding her together. She hadn't spoken to anyone since she arrived. Not that anyone had tried. Her faded denim jacket was stained at the sleeves, and her boots were scuffed raw. She looked like someone who hadn't just lost something, but someone who had run out of things to lose. Her gaze swept over the horses that had already been paraded out. A limping bay sold for meat, a gray gelding with clouded eyes that no one bid on, and then came the one that made the murmurs rise. A skeletal chestnut was dragged into the pen. His coat hung in patches over his ribs, every bone in his body sharply defined beneath his skin. The auctioneer gave a sharp laugh before he even began. "This next one's more bones than horse," he said, trying to draw a chuckle from the disinterested crowd. "Let's start at $10. Anyone?" Silence. A man near the front spat into the dirt. "5." The auctioneer tried again, glancing toward stands. A few people shifted, but no hands rose. 3. Still nothing. The horse stood motionless, his head lowered as if bracing for one more humiliation. His right eye was crusted shut, the left dull and sunken. Claire stepped forward. Her boots scraped against the concrete, the sound louder than it should have been. The auctioneer paused. "Got a bidder?" She nodded. 3. The word fell flat, quiet, almost apologetic. A ripple of laughter passed through the small crowd. A teenage boy nudged his friend, and someone muttered, "She just bought herself a corpse." "Sold," the auctioneer barked, eager to move on. Claire's heart pounded. Not with excitement, fear maybe. Doubt. She didn't know why she had stepped forward. Only that something in the horse's posture had looked too familiar. She approached the pen slowly. The horse didn't lift his head. Up close, the stench hit her first. Rot, infection, neglect. He was barely breathing. Her hand trembled as she touched his neck. His skin twitched under her fingers, and for a second, his one open eye flicked to hers. There was nothing in it but exhaustion. But he hadn't flinched. She whispered, "You're not done. Not yet." Loading him into the trailer was a test of patience, strength, and hope. The old ramp groaned under the horse's weight, and twice she thought he would collapse. But somehow, inch by inch, he got in. Claire secured the gate and sat in the truck, hands gripping the wheel until her knuckles turned white. The ride home was silent except for the occasional thump from the trailer as the horse shifted. She drove slowly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror like she could keep him alive by sheer will. The ranch wasn't much. A tired barn, one good paddock, and a porch that sagged at one end. It had been her father's pride once. Now it was more memory than home. She backed the trailer up to the barn and opened the gate. The horse didn't move. Claire didn't call to him. She stepped inside and waited. Minutes passed. Then one foot moved. Another. Every step looked like it cost him a battle. When he finally reached the straw-covered floor, he crumpled into it. Claire knelt beside him, brushing flies from his withers. "Whiskey," she said softly, not knowing where the name had come from. It felt right. "That's what I'll call you. You've got that fire in your gut, even if the rest of you forgot it was there." He didn't respond. She didn't expect him to. She set up a fan near the stall, brought him a bucket of water, and laid an old blanket over his side. It was all she could do. Then she sat back on her heels and watched him breathe, slow and shallow. Outside, the sun was setting behind a curtain of gray clouds. A storm was coming. Claire stepped out onto the porch and looked out at the open fields. Somewhere out there were people with real money, real barns, perfect horses with shiny coats and train gates. She had bought a dying horse for $3. She remembered her father's voice. "Don't waste your heart on something that doesn't want saving, Claire. But if it wants it, even a little, you fight harder than anyone else ever did." Inside the barn, Whiskey coughed once, weakly. Then he lifted his head just an inch and looked toward the open door. Claire watched him from the porch. That flicker in his movement, it was something. Not strength. Not yet. But not surrender either. She exhaled slowly, the breath heavy with everything she'd been carrying. Then, for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a thought she hadn't dared consider. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it was the start of something else. And maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't face it alone. The next morning came wrapped in silence, save for the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional groan of wood in the barn's weather-beaten walls. Claire woke on the cot in the feed room, her back aching, the stiffness of another night on burlap sacks settling in her bones. She rubbed her face and stood slowly, reaching for her coat. The air smelled faintly of dust and hay, less foul than yesterday, but still tinged with sickness. Whiskey hadn't moved much during the night. He still lay on his side, one leg stretched out stiffly, the other tucked awkwardly under him. His breathing was shallow, but steady. Claire knelt beside him, brushing the straw from his hide. She dipped her rag into a bucket of warm water and gently cleaned the crust from around his eye. He didn't resist. He didn't acknowledge her, either. But his body didn't flinch the way it had the first time she'd touched him. "I'm going to get you standing today," she whispered. "You don't have to walk. Just stand." She made a mash of soaked oats and electrolytes, spooned it into an old metal dish, and placed it inches from his muzzle. Then she waited. Minutes passed. Finally, with a slight shift of his neck and a flutter of his nostrils, he inched his nose toward the food. It was clumsy, slow, but it was a beginning. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The vet arrived around noon, a woman named Dr. Howard, all business, with sleeves rolled high and a clipboard that never left her side. She raised a brow at Whiskey's condition, but said nothing until she'd taken his vitals and inspected the infected sores along his flank. "He shouldn't be alive," she muttered. Claire folded her arms. "But he is." Dr. Howard pursed her lips. "If I'd seen him yesterday, I would have advised euthanasia. Now, I'm not sure. If he makes it through the week, we'll talk options. Until then, painkillers, antibiotics, and fluids. Nothing more." "I'll do whatever it takes," Claire said. Dr. Howard glanced around the barn. "You'll need help. And money." Claire nodded. "I'll find a way." After the vet left, Claire rummaged through the loft, digging out her father's old supplies. There was still enforced stand and tubing. Enough medications to get them through the first few days. Every hour, she returned to the stall to check on Whiskey, speaking to him in low, rhythmic tones, reading aloud from books or reciting old stories her father used to tell. Not for him, perhaps, but for herself. The quiet filled the gaps where doubt tried to creep in. Each morning brought a test. Could she get him to stand? Could she get him to drink? On the fourth day, he made it to his knees. On the fifth, he tried to rise but collapsed in a heap. Claire didn't cry. She whispered, "Tomorrow," and cleaned him up again. By the end of the first week, he stood, only for a few minutes, but it was enough to bring her to her knees with gratitude. The wind howled outside that night, rattling the barn roof, but inside, the light from the heat lamp glowed like a beacon. Claire's days became a pattern. Tend to Whiskey, work part-time cleaning stalls at a neighbor's ranch, return home to care for him again. Her body ached from the rhythm of it, but the progress was undeniable. His coat grew less dull. His eyes began to follow her movements. His ears twitched when she called his name. One afternoon, while brushing out the last of the burrs tangled in his mane, she caught herself humming, a lullaby her father used to sing while mucking stalls. The sound startled her. It had been months since she'd made music of any kind. Whiskey's ear flicked toward her. He didn't move otherwise, but the gesture felt like connection. She stepped back and looked at him fully for the first time. He was still thin, still fragile, but something inside him had changed. There was weight in his stare now. Recognition, not of who she was, but what she represented. Presence, perhaps. A reason to lift his head. She remembered the auction man laughing. She just bought herself a corpse. She hadn't. She'd bought herself a fight. A week later, she began walking him short distances, leading him with gentle tugs on the rope halter. guiding him around the barnyard. His steps were slow and uneven. Sometimes he stumbled, but he followed. The locals noticed. Old ranchers on their morning drives slowed to peer through the wire fence. At first, they shook their heads. Then one or two waved. A girl from town came by to drop off a bag of apples. A small gesture, but to Claire, it felt monumental. Not everyone was supportive. Dale showed up one morning, leaning against the corral with a smirk beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His presence unsettled Claire instantly. "Well, I'll be," he said. "Thought that thing would have keeled over by now." "He has a name," Claire said. Dale chuckled. "You always did love lost causes. Like your old man." Claire stepped between him and the gate. "You got something to say, say it." "I'll buy him off you," Dale said, flicking a toothpick from his teeth. "Give him a quiet ending. No one would blame you." Claire didn't flinch. "He's not yours to end." Dale shrugged and turned to leave. "You'll break before that horse does," he said. "Trust me." She watched his truck disappear in a trail of dust. Her jaw ached from how tightly she'd clenched it. She turned back to Whiskey, who had watched the entire exchange without a blink. Claire ran a hand down his neck. "I'm not quitting," she murmured. "And neither are you." That night, Claire sat outside the stall, her back against the barn wall. Whiskey stood behind her, resting quietly. A breeze carried the scent of earth and rain. She thought of her father again, of how hard he'd worked, how often he'd been knocked down and gotten back up. She imagined him watching now, nodding quietly. Whiskey shifted, and the creaking of wood told her he had taken a step closer. She didn't look up, didn't speak, but she smiled, just slightly, as the night deepened around them. The first sign of trouble was so small, Claire almost missed it. Whiskey, now walking with more stability, didn't come to the gate that morning. He always did. Since he'd found the strength to stand, he had taken to waiting for her, ears perked, eyes expectant. But today, he remained near the back of the paddock, his head low, tail twitching with irritation. Claire's boots sank into the damp ground as she crossed to him. The rain from the night before had left the soil soft, and the air smelled of wet hay. She knelt beside him, running her fingers lightly down his legs, across his chest, to his belly, then froze. His skin was hot to the touch, and there was a small, swollen mass near the old scar by his flank. She stepped back, heart sinking. The scar she'd noticed weeks ago, one she'd assumed was from an old fall, was now angry and inflamed. Her mind moved quickly, connecting the signs. Whiskey's labored breath, the reduced appetite, the way his stride had shortened recently. It wasn't fatigue. It was pain. Dr. Howard arrived an hour later. She was quiet as she examined Wound, her brows knitting tightly together. She didn't look at Claire until after she'd pressed gently into the swelling and felt Whiskey's whole body shudder. "There's something inside," she said. "Metal, maybe. I need to run a scan." Claire's throat tightened. How could we have missed this? It was dormant. Now it's not. They sedated him gently and took him to the nearest facility with basic imaging equipment. Claire stood beside the machine, watching the screen as the image developed. A small piece of metal, jagged, foreign, lay embedded near his hip joint. "A bullet fragment," Dr. Howard murmured. "Looks like it was never fully removed. Could be from years ago. It shifted somehow. Might have always been there, buried deeper." Claire felt like the ground shifted beneath her. She stared at the screen, at the unmistakable mark of violence left behind in her horse's body. "Do you know his history?" the vet asked. Claire shook her head. "Nothing. Just the auction papers. No brand info. No background." Dr. Howard stepped out to make some calls. Claire stayed behind, her hand resting on Whiskey's shoulder as he dozed under sedation. He looked peaceful, almost unaware of the storm building around him again. She dug through the crumpled folder she'd been handed on auction day. Most of it was useless. Lot numbers, minimal notes, vague remarks. But in the corner of one sheet was a nearly faded stamp. 3 digits followed by a letter. It wasn't a farm code. It was a Federal Registry mark. Claire typed it into her phone, unsure what she'd find. At first, nothing came up. Then, a forum post from 5 years ago mentioned a similar code. used for horses that had served in law enforcement or military programs. She clicked through links, cross-referencing descriptions, reports of retired mounts, missing horses, those rehomed or lost in the system. And then she saw it. A chestnut gelding, military-trained, last assigned to a mounted patrol unit, awarded for bravery during a wildfire evacuation, declared euthanized 3 years ago due to injury. The name listed Valor. She stared at the screen, blinking hard. Whiskey Valor had served, had been honored, and then quietly discarded. Her chest swelled with a mix of rage and heartbreak. They'd left him to die. Someone had decided he wasn't worth saving, but he had survived. Somehow. And she had found him. That night, back at the barn, Whiskey struggled to stand. The sedative had mostly worn off, but he was groggy, weak again. Claire wrapped him in blankets, sat beside him in the straw, and whispered his name, his real name. "I know who you are," she said. "They called you Valor, and they forgot you, but I won't." She barely slept. By morning, Whiskey had managed to rise, but his breathing was heavier than before. The infection was spreading. Dr. Howard returned with a surgical team's assessment. Removing the fragment would be delicate and risky, but possible. The cost, however, would be far beyond Claire's reach. "I can't let him go now," Claire said. "You shouldn't," the vet replied softly. "But you need to decide fast." Claire stared at the old saddle hanging in the tack room. Her father's saddle, worn smooth from years of riding, the leather dark with memory. She had once sworn she'd never sell it, but now it hung silently, while the horse she had saved hovered between life and death. That afternoon, she drove into town and handed it to a collector who had once offered her a good price. She left without the saddle, but with a check in her hand. Whiskey was scheduled for surgery the next morning. The operating area had been prepped in a mobile vet truck set up beside the barn. Claire held his halter as they sedated him again, whispering to him over and over, "You'll be okay. You're strong. You're not alone." When the final needle was inserted and his eyes closed, she stepped back and let them work. The hours crawled. Rain began to fall in cold sheets, beating against the barn roof. Claire sat under the eaves, soaked to the knees, her hands clenched around the faded registry paper. Finally, Dr. Howard emerged, tired but smiling faintly. "We got it," she said. "Clean removal. He's got a real shot now." Claire didn't cry, not yet. She nodded, murmured a quiet thank you, and stepped into the barn. Whiskey lay still, wrapped in warm blankets, and dripping slowly into his vein. She sat beside him and took his hoof in her hands. "I know they left you," she said softly. "I know you've been through more than I can imagine, but you're not just surviving anymore. You're coming back." Whiskey didn't move, but his breathing steadied. Claire leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling her down. Still, her eyes never left him. She wouldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. The weeks following the surgery moved in slow, cautious steps. Whiskey's body was still fragile, but the change in his eyes was undeniable. They no longer held the glassy, far-off emptiness of a creature bracing for the end. Instead, they followed Claire's every movement with quiet awareness. His ears perked when she entered the barn. He nickered softly when she spoke. The bond they'd forged through suffering had solidified into something unspoken but undeniable. Each morning began the same way. Claire would pour his grain, mix in his medications, and then lead him gently into the paddock for their short walks. His steps grew stronger each day. Once shaky legs now carried him with measured confidence. The scars across his flank were still visible, but they no longer defined him. He walked beside her with quiet dignity, his head held higher than it had ever been. People began to notice. It started with neighbors leaning over fences, murmuring disbelief. Then came the visitors, first one, then a handful. Word had spread in town about the girl who'd bought a dying horse for $3 and brought him back to life. An old woman from the diner dropped off carrots. A young boy brought a handmade halter. For once, Claire didn't shrink from their attention. She accepted the small acts of kindness with a nod, always deflecting praise back to Whiskey. Still, not everyone welcomed the story. One crisp morning, As Claire led Whiskey out to stretch under the golden light of early sun, Dale's truck rumbled into view, kicking up dust. He stepped out, looking sharp and smug as ever, a clean jacket draped over one shoulder. His stallion, Titan, stood tethered in the trailer, stomping and snorting like he sensed something worth trampling. Dale leaned on the fence post. Heard the rumors. Thought I'd see for myself. Claire didn't stop brushing Whiskey's side. See what? The miracle horse, Dale said, folding his arms. The one you dragged out of the grave. Claire said nothing. She adjusted Whiskey's lead and moved to check his hooves. Dale smirked. He's not as dead as I expected. Still looks half broken, though. Whiskey shifted slightly, his ears twitching, but he remained calm. Claire ran her hand along his neck. Half broken is more alive than you'll ever understand. Dale stepped closer. There's a showcase in 2 weeks. Local trainers, rescue cases, competition style. A chance to show what your horse can really do. Why not bring him? Let the world see what all the fuss is about. Claire narrowed her eyes. You want to parade Titan around, show off how perfectly sculpted he is. And you want me to be your contrast. He shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe I want to see if you really believe in that bag of bones. She didn't answer. But after he drove off, the idea wouldn't leave her. That night, Claire sat in the barn, her back against Whiskey's stall as wind rustled the roof. She turned the idea over in her mind. It wasn't about Dale. Not really. It was about Whiskey. About the journey they'd taken together. If there was a chance to show people that broken didn't mean worthless, then maybe it was worth doing. She entered them the next morning. The 2 weeks leading to the event were filled with early mornings, sore muscles, and quiet determination. Claire worked with Whiskey slowly, never pushing too hard. She led him through basic groundwork, taught him to respond to light touch, gentle cues, voice commands. There was no trotting, no flashy movements. Just trust, just rhythm, just recovery. The day of the showcase dawned clear and cold. The field was filled with trailers, horses gleaming from hours of brushing, handlers dressed in neat polos and pressed jeans. Claire arrived in her old truck, Whiskey's trailer rattling behind her. Her boots were clean, but worn. Her jacket had patches at the elbows. Whiskey stepped down from the trailer like he knew exactly where he was. He stood straight, eyes alert, ears flicking calmly at the sounds around him. Claire walked him across the field. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. She felt them watching, their curiosity mingled with disbelief. But she kept her head high. One by one, the horses performed. Barrel turns, high steps, precision movement. Titan strutted through his pattern like a machine, every movement perfect and rehearsed. The crowd applauded. Dale tipped his hat smugly. Then it was Claire's turn. There was no performance music, no fancy saddle, no tricks. Claire led Whiskey into the ring and unhooked his lead rope. For a second, the crowd murmured in confusion. But then Claire stepped back, gave a small hand signal, and Whiskey began to move. He didn't trot. He didn't canter. He simply walked slow, deliberate, eyes locked on Claire. She moved to one side. He followed. She circled. He mirrored her arc. When she stopped, he did too. So close their shadows overlapped. He lowered his head, pressed his muzzle softly into her chest. The audience went silent. From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward, older, in uniform, eyes wide. "That's not Whiskey," he said quietly. "That's Valor." Claire turned toward him. "You knew him?" The man nodded slowly. "I rode with him. He saved 3 people during the Ridge Fire evacuation. We thought he was gone." Murmurs spread. Someone began filming. Claire felt the emotion swell in her throat, but she held firm. She looked at Whiskey, Valor, and felt every moment of their struggle rise inside her like a tide. "He was gone," she said softly, "but he came back." The applause began as a ripple and turned into a wave. Claire didn't move. She stood beside Valor and let the sound wash over them. Later, after the crowd had dispersed and the sun dipped low, Claire sat on the hill above her ranch. Valor grazed nearby, his coat catching the last golden light of the day. The barn below had been repaired with donations and volunteers who showed up after the showcase. A few panels of the fence had fresh paint. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. She watched him for a long time. "You're not what they thought you were," she said quietly. "You're more. You always were." Valor lifted his head, as if understanding her, as if agreeing. Claire leaned back on her elbows and looked at the wide sky above. For the first time in a long while, it felt full of possibility. They had saved each other, not by force, not by hope alone, but by choosing, again and again, to believe that broken things were still worth holding on to.